Dr. Hall, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. And we're going to invite you to please share your thoughts with us on our topic today, and then we'll turn it over to the panel for questions.
Well, thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I've heard about the work you all do, and I'm very impressed by it. So I want to back into the Connecticut Compromise by highlighting something that's been very important to me throughout my scholarly career. When Americans think of the founding era, usually 5 or 6 individuals come to mind. George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Ben Franklin. If you think about it for a minute, 4 of those 6 became president of the United States. With the exception of Franklin, they were all young men, and so they could play an important role in our federal republic. Unfortunately, oftentimes founders like Roger Sherman from Connecticut is overlooked. And I'm not suggesting he's as great as George Washington, but he really did play a critically important role in the American founding. So he's the only founder to help draft and sign the Declaration and Resolves, the Articles of Association, the Declaration of Independence, and he was actually in the 5-person committee that put that together, the Articles of Confederation, the U.S. Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And a number of scholars have pointed out that if not for the interaction between Sherman and Madison, almost certainly the Constitution would have not been ratified by eventually all of the states. So Sherman's incredibly important. As we're going to see, he plays an important role in a couple of key compromises that made the Constitution possible. So Sherman is a self-made man. He's born to a lower middle-class family in Massachusetts. When his father dies, he moves up to Connecticut. He's a cobbler, and eventually he becomes an almanac maker, does some surveying, and some of the attorneys he interacts with as he does the surveying notice that he has a really sharp mind. So they encourage him to read law, which he does, and then eventually he becomes a state politician. He's elected to the lower house. He's elected to the upper house. He's elected, or he's appointed to the Superior Court of Connecticut, even as he's serving in the upper house. And so as America entered its conflict with Great Britain, he's appointed to the First and Second Continental Congress, served throughout the Continental and Confederation Congress. And when Connecticut sent individuals to Philadelphia in 1787, he was one of the 3 who was selected to go. Now, Sherman arrived at the Constitutional Convention 3 days late, that is 3 days after it had begun, and he was shocked. He was absolutely shocked by Madison's Virginia plan. The Virginia plan would have created a national legislature based solely on proportional representation. So a state like New York would have many, many times the number of representatives of a small state like New Jersey or Rhode Island, at the time anyway. And not only was it solely based on proportional representation in the lower house would have selected the upper house. And so because New York and Virginia and Pennsylvania would have had so many more delegates in the lower house, they would have dominated the upper house. And as well, then the legislature would select the executive and the judiciary. So the large states would have dominated. And this really bothered Sherman. He thought this was a bad idea. And Connecticut's not even that small of a state. It's the 6th largest state in terms of white population in 1787. So it's not a large state, but it's definitely not a tiny little state. Moreover, and this really worried Sherman, Madison would have given the national government a plenary grant of power. That is, the power to do whatever it saw fit. No limitations on the power of the national government. So right away, Sherman said, I'm going to paraphrase him, but essentially he said, you have got to be kidding me. We can't give the national government unlimited power. And so he proposed almost right away what eventually became Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. And that, of course, enumerates the powers of Congress. It limits the national government to things that the national government really needs to do. And everything else that governments might do or should do is left to the states or the localities. So important things like education and helping the poor and punishing criminals, all of that would be left to the state governments or local governments. All right, so that was, I think, one important compromise. I think if the national Constitution had come out of Philadelphia with a plenary grant of power, there's no way it would have been ratified. Similarly, if it had come out of Philadelphia based solely on proportional representation, I can't imagine any small state or any medium-sized state that would have ratified it. The smaller states were perfectly content with the Articles of Confederation, where, of course, they had equal representation in Congress, and they didn't want to give that up. And so you have both sides. There's very principled men in Philadelphia debating these things, but they're also practical politicians. And the small states say, look, we're not going to give up all of our power and let the large states dominate everything. And the large states said, reasonably enough, it's unfair that you tiny little states have exactly as much power as we have. Now, Sherman, as I already suggested, he's a self-made man. He's very smart, but he didn't even go to college. But he's a practical man. And almost everyone who comments on him, we have records of people commenting on him, would say things like, well, he's not particularly eloquent, but he's sharp as a tack, and he's practical, and he gets things done. And so Sherman came up with an idea, and he proposed that what we could do is compromise. Why don't we have the states be represented proportionally in the House? And so if a state has, say, 16 times the population of a small state, it would have 16 times the number of representatives. And so that's fair to the large states. But then we will have equal representation in the Senate. Every state will get 2 senators, regardless of size. And so now the little small state will be equal with the large state in the U.S. Senate. And moreover, and this is something we neglect nowadays, but Sherman said a critical part of this operation is to have the state legislatures appoint the senators. And this would give the states a very important state, say, as states in the national government. Now, of course, we eventually got rid of this idea that the state legislatures would appoint the senators, and we went to the direct election of senators in 1917 or so, right around there, 1913 maybe. And Sherman warned, if we get the state legislatures out of the business of appointing senators, we might as well say goodbye to federalism. We'll have a run-amok national government, and this is, of course, exactly what we get about 30 years after we get the states out of the business of appointing senators. I'm not saying it's only for that reason, but I think Sherman had an important insight. Sherman's younger colleague, Oliver Ellsworth, also contributed to this compromise. So both of them working together put together the compromise that had the large states be represented proportionally in the House and equally in the Senate. And that's why it's routinely referred to, this compromise, it's routinely referred to as the Connecticut Compromise. And again, I just think it's inconceivable to think that the Constitution would have been ratified without it. If Madison had gotten his way and the Virginia plan had been sent to the states, it would have been ratified by Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania, maybe 1 or 2 other states, but there's no way that 9 of the 13 states would have ratified it, and certainly not all of them ratify it as eventually happened. So I'll just stop there. I'm Roger Sherman and the Connecticut Compromise.
Well, thank you. That was a great overview. And I had no idea that Roger Sherman was to think for Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. Really interesting. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Janine.
Okay, I'm here. Well, I have to tell you, hello, everybody, and thank you so much for being our guest today. And I just think the Connecticut Compromise should be studied in every classroom in America many times, grade school, junior high, high school, college, because it's really the way business should be done. It's interesting how you talk about the fact that the Constitution wouldn't have even been probably passed if it had stayed the way Madison had put it forth. But I think the Connecticut Compromise is such a wonderful example of how we need to be, our Congress and the people that we elect need to work with each other and find these kind of compromises to get to the bottom of the serious issues that plague our country today. And I'm glad that these men were willing to do it. The primary question in my mind is the correlation between the Electoral College and the Connecticut Compromise with this proportional Of course, it the argument that if you keep primarily just a proportional representation in Congress, then so many of the states will not be in a fair position. They won't be represented fairly. And I think the Electoral College is something that's very, very similar. Do you see that similarity between this James Madison's proposal of proportional only, and the big states would have all the power and the little states population wouldn't have very much power? And if we were to get rid of the Electoral College, that we would be in that same situation?
Yeah, I think that's a very insightful question. So I think originally the founders, they were Republicans. They weren't small d Democrats, and they really didn't trust the average voter. George Mason actually said allowing the average voter to select the president would be like letting a blind man select colors. And so I think the original thought was we'll have this electoral college where the state legislatures will meet and pick really, really smart, well-qualified people and send them off. And then the electoral college itself would be a deliberative body and would eventually select the president themselves. They didn't think people would be getting the majority
Well,
of the
I
vote.
think yes, but I think what I'm referring to is modern day electoral college. You know, that the representatives that are elected, that are kept private, by the way, which I think is really interesting. Their names are kept private, which that'd be an interesting thing to discuss. I believe that's correct. But they're sent to represent the majority of the people in their state. So it's really not so much just two electoral people in the state get to go decide who president. I think that's a dangerous way of looking at it currently today. It's really that this electoral college, these representatives are going to cast a vote in a Republican format for the majority of what the majority of the people want in their state. I think the correlation that I'm making is that if we got rid of the electoral college, we would be in the same boat as James Madison proportional only government. Because if we were to get rid of the electoral college, then we would have it would be California, New York, and Texas who decided who the president would be, and it wouldn't matter the people how they vote in Wyoming or Idaho or small countries like that. So I think that's what I'd like to focus on, just that comparison.
Yeah, sure. No, that's great. So the Electoral College did not work out as the founders intended. We have the rise of the two-party system. And what every state has done is basically allows the voters select who the electors are. So in many states, they do actually list them, and you can vote for the Republican slate of electors or the Democratic ones. Every state but two has a winner-take-all system. So if you win the most votes in that state, you get all of the electors. Two states are slightly outside of that. And I think you're exactly right in your insight. First of all, the Electoral College gives the smallest states a slight advantage because you have as many electors as you have senators plus representatives. And so a place like Montana is slightly disproportionately represented there. But also because the candidates are not seeking the popular vote, they have to pay attention to a lot of other states. And we've seen this in spades in this election, right? Both candidates are spending tons of time in the swing states, whereas if they were simply pursuing the popular vote, they could probably ignore the swing states and just focus in on New York, California, and a few other large states. And not only large states, but large cities within the states, because you'd just be trying to gin up a lot of turnout and not be concerned with winning states. So yeah, I think the Electoral College still plays a very important role, even though it doesn't work as the founders thought it would work.
Well, it may be a little bit different, but the principle is the same. In that, I think Sherman would have really liked it. It's like, you can't, you have to be able to represent the smaller states, and that's what the Electoral College gives us, as you eloquently just mentioned as well. Anyway, I just think that's a fascinating kind of comparison. But so it was. It was Sherman in Connecticut, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then it was Madison in Virginia. But then who was the third? There was the third. One wanted, and I'm sorry, I came in a little late, so I may have missed it, but Madison wanted proportional only. The other state wanted everybody just to have the same exact. And then, Connecticut came in with the compromise. What was the other state?
Yeah, the New Jersey plan by William Patterson
Right.
equal representation. No, that's exactly right. So you had the Virginia plan first, Then you have the New Jersey plan. You have Alexander Hamilton give a crazy nationalist speech that I think just scares everyone. And these things set up the set the table really for the Connecticut Compromise, which really is a compromise between the two obvious alternatives.
Yeah. I'm going to pass because, everybody has to ask questions, and I just thank you again so much today. But so, the way the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Federalist Papers, the sort of, light of inspiration of higher power and in the midst of these men, and how they all came together to put these documents together. And we focus on so many other things, but the reason I wanted to do the Connecticut Compromise today is because I think this, as you just said, it was pivotal. It probably wouldn't have even passed. And I wanted also for it to be a big part of our Constitution Day show, because it's just a great example of a civic conversation, people coming together for what's best for the country as a nation as a whole, and compromising. And I guess my last question would be, to you, I certainly think we need a lot more of that today. Would you agree with that?
Oh, I absolutely agree. I think one of the things Philadelphia had going for it is they closed the doors and they closed the windows and they didn't allow the media to come in. And so rather than grandstanding, these folks could talk to each other and they could compromise. And they didn't have to worry about being primaried from the right or the left if you compromise, which is, of course, a great problem today. So yeah, I agree with you absolutely. We need a lot more of the spirit of 1776 and 1787, the willingness to work together and compromise, to recognize that not everyone gets everything they want. Sherman definitely didn't get everything he wanted. He hated the idea of concentrated power in the chief executive. He fought it at every turn, and he lost many of those votes. But he still went back to Connecticut and advocated for the Constitution. He was an important Federalist there. He didn't just go home and cry in his cereal and oppose the thing. Yes, we need a lot more of that spirit of compromise today.
And I think we talk about the majority, and that our First Amendment rights really help the minority be able to stand up against the majority, or vice versa, however you want to use the first. But it's just, if the majority wins, the voice of the minority is kept because of our ability to petition and have our freedom of speech and freedom of press and whatnot. But if you think about it, a lot of times when you're talking about the closed door aspect, and I forgot to say my name. This is Janine Turner. We're trying to do that now. But when we talk about the closed door aspect of it gave them the freedom to really be able to have a conversation without, in the modern day, being, viciously attacked on social media. But a lot of times on social media, it's just a few people making a lot of noise that are scaring everybody. And if you really were to poll the majority of Americans, they probably would be wholeheartedly in support of negotiations. But it's these fringe groups, and they're actually, if you aren't that many people, but our representatives are so afraid of them, and they can do so much damage. And that's a really good point about our social media. And
I know we need to move on, but let me follow up because I think the story is just so appropriate. So after the Constitution is ratified, Virginia elects Madison to the first federal Congress. Connecticut elects Sherman to the first federal Congress. Now, we call Madison the father of the Bill of Rights, and sure enough, he was there advocating for it. But if you read Madison's initial speech, he wanted to put the Bill of Rights in the body of the Constitution itself. And he said, the most important amendment I have is a restriction on the ability of states, which, of course, most of the Bill of Rights that we know doesn't do that at all. Roger Sherman fought him on these things, and Sherman was the one that got them to put the Bill of Rights at the end of the Constitution. Sherman was able to kill this amendment that never would have been ratified. And every amendment that Madison put forward was altered. Sherman played a role in that. Others did as well, of course. But my point, to going towards your point, is you had this compromise within the first federal Congress that resulted in a Bill of Rights that would then be ratified by the state legislatures. That today plays a very important role in protecting minority rights. It protects majority rights as well, but we usually highlight the minority rights. So again, compromise, it wasn't just a one-time thing in Philadelphia. They did it in New York. And back in the 18th century, they seemed to be able to do it a heck of a lot more than we do today.
Yeah, well, probably because they had that privacy, and that was probably a big part of it. But we do like to be able to know what's going on in our government. But to be able to negotiate in private is pretty important, I think. But God bless Sherman. He needs to have a lot more. A lot more attention. He needs to be up there with kind of the elite group of founding fathers that we always discuss. But thank you so much. And I'm going to pass so that everybody else has a chance to talk. Thank you so much.
Hello, this is Joel Gilbert. Thanks so much for being on. It's awesome to hear what Sherman brought to the design of our entire nation. Could you talk a little bit more about that difference of that Sherman and Connecticut Compromise idea of the way that the states are represented a little bit less than just proportionally, and more so as each of the states having a value in the United States of America, not America, but actually the United States of America, and just talk about that, how important it was then, and then you alluded to it a bit, how we have gone a little bit more towards being more so of America instead of the United States of America. I don't think that, especially some of our educated listeners probably fully understand this, but I think that especially many of our students, that's a pretty interesting and big concept.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I think, and I don't know if this is exactly what you're getting at, but I'll get at your question or statement in this way. When we think of states' rights, I think immediately we think of opposition to the civil rights movement and governors standing in the schoolhouse gate and that sort of thing. So it just has a really, really bad negative connotation. But I think to the founders and in the constitutional order they designed, they thought states played a very, very important role and that they should be protected as such. And that, in fact, states serve as an important check on the national government. We don't want to concentrate all power in the national government. We want to give the national government only limited enumerated powers, and then states will be doing a lot of important things on their own. So one of the ways the Connecticut Compromise plays into this is the House really is kind of the people's branch. The Constitution stipulates that the qualification for electors for members of the House of Representatives will be the same as that for the lower house of the states. And so in the 18th century, this means pretty widespread suffrage. As we get to the 1830s, pretty much all white males get to vote. And of course, that's not sufficient. We want females to be able to vote. We want slavery to be ended and African Americans to be able to. So I'm not saying it's sufficient, but it really is quite democratic. And so the people make their voices heard through the House of Representatives. And of course, the states are represented proportionately. The ideal was that the state legislatures meeting in Richmond or whatever, Baltimore, whatever the state capital is, the state legislatures would come together. Now, keep in mind, these are democratically elected, so we aren't talking about some sort of hereditary aristocracy or something, but, the members of the lower house and the upper house of Virginia would come together and argue and debate and then vote, and they would select someone to go to what is eventually Washington, D.C., really in important respects to represent the states. And if that person goes to Washington, D.C., say, and is a bad representative of the state legislature can yank him out after 6 years. And so the states are represented as states. Roger Sherman literally warned, he said, if we get rid of the state selection of the senators, we might as well kiss federalism goodbye. I'm paraphrasing, but essentially that's what he said. And again, I already alluded to the 17th Amendment, 1913, where we, the United States people, give to the voters the ability to select.
Yeah, I don't want to interrupt. But right there, so important. So can you tell, almost functionally or philosophically, how do we lose federalism through making that a popular decision instead of the way it was originally designed?
And I don't want to suggest that's the only factor, but I think what you do is
Yeah,
the states now have less power as states. So now basically everything is stemming from the American people. That is, the American people are selecting members of the House, the American people are selecting the Senate, and effectively, the American people are selecting the President of the United States, even though we do have this electoral college, which sometimes results in a winner who didn't win the popular vote. But in effect, everything's based on the people, and the states have been washed out. And so it took 20 years, but as you all know, in the 1930s, basically Congress just started ignoring Article 1, Section 8, doing whatever it wanted, even if it didn't have clearly enumerated powers. Now, they made arguments based on the Commerce Clause or the Necessary and Proper Clause, but
I
these are
just want
bad
to interrupt
arguments.
one more time. Tell me if you agree with this then, so that we had a system of checks and balances, and it wasn't just between the branches of the national government, but it was also between the state to national government. And as the power shifted and the checks and balance lessened through that popular vote change, then our national government is able to infringe on more of those unalienable rights, or more of those even just administrative, uh, take on a bigger administrative burden, which automatically makes them more powerful. Would you agree with that
I
kind of
agree. Absolutely. I think that's a great point. So usually we think checks and balances, separation of powers. Well, the president can veto a law and Congress can override the veto. And those things are in place and they're important. But a critical check on the national government was Article 1, Section 8, to say the national government's only going to have limited power. And if you read through that and think about it, they really are things we probably need a national government to do, to have a military, to regulate interstate commerce, to have post offices. It doesn't touch education. It doesn't touch crime. It doesn't touch poverty. Now, these are important issues, but I think in the founders' minds, it would be states that would address these issues, or localities, or maybe some of them wouldn't be addressed by governments, and voluntary societies and churches would address them. But it wouldn't be the national government. We know that for sure. Since 1936, we've just blown that away, and we see the enormous growth of the national government, and the national government doing more and more and more. Now, there's some things since 1936 the national government does that I like, taking a strong stand against Jim Crow legislation and segregation. But let me point out that it has the power to do that through the 13th and 14th Amendments. And so, to my way of thinking, I would love to get the national government back within its appropriate boundaries, those boundaries laid out in Article 1, Section 8, and subsequent relevant amendments.
I think it's fascinating that that Sherman and Ellsworth, I believe the other gentleman's name was. It's fascinating the way that we have a philosophical or practical or a systematic discussion about how to accomplish something, and these men came together and they basically fought for their belief of how to achieve this goal from a procedural from a procedural standpoint as well. Once they kind of philosophically agreed somewhat, then they were fighting on how to get there. That's fairly remarkable. I think you said that Sherman wasn't formally educated as much as you would say that the others were, but he was still brilliant. Could you maybe tell us, do you think that that's part of, so was this Connecticut Compromise somewhat of a practical solution? Do you think that played a role, or just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, first of all, the founding generation was a mixed bag. Some went to college, plenty of them didn't. This was the era where no one went to law school, pretty much literally. If you wanted to be an attorney, you would read law under a practicing attorney, basically an apprenticeship. I do think Sherman and pretty much everyone in New England was literate. He was very well read, and so he was very self-taught in both the law and politics and other things. But I do think he had a practical edge to him, where someone like Thomas Jefferson, and he's a great founder, don't get me wrong, but sometimes he could engage in flights of fancy where he talks about the importance of the tree of liberty being watered by the blood of patriots every 20 years, stuff like that. That's just kind of crazy. And I think James Wilson from Scotland, the subject of my first book, he had these fancy ideas. He was incredibly well educated, but he literally wanted the direct popular election of representatives, senators, and the President of the United States. Now, that's just, I think, a horrible idea, and it's an idea that absolutely would have fallen flat on its face in the 18th century. So there's a brilliant guy who comes up with very impractical ideas, or someone like a Sherman, and he wasn't right about everything, to be sure, but he's very practical, and he's able to find compromises and get things done, which is something we need a lot more of today, in my opinion.
Yeah, the one thing I'll kind of leave with is it's interesting when you listen to the different founders argue their points and how, it gets fiery, um, and what they claim about the others' ideas and how terrible their ideas are. There's a certain amount of agreement around the concept of natural rights, the concept of inalienable rights, and the concept of the government being set up to protect those. And that to me is a much more that's like the foundation principle of why is the government set up or not set up, how is it set up. But we can get all the way from Hamilton to Sherman with both of them somewhat wanting to figure out a way to protect those rights and provide good for people, even though they're somewhat the opposite. Could you leave us with maybe what Sherman's idea is of, does he ever talk about, do we have any evidence for what he believed government's primary role was, the way that we have some of the other founders?
Yes, I think you're just spot on. I tend to think that the Declaration of Independence is a mission statement of the United States, especially that wonderful sentence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Keep in mind, Sherman was on that 5-person committee that put the Declaration together, and he acted on it. In 1783, he helped revise all of Connecticut's laws, and he came up with the gradual manumission law, a law that put slavery in Connecticut on the road to extinction. And something like 8 states between 1776 and 1804 either immediately abolished slavery or put it on the road to extinction. And that's to highlight in a very controversial area where I think you're exactly right. This is a shared commitment that the founders had to natural rights, and they're making important steps to better protect natural rights. Unfortunately, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, and the production of certain sorts of cotton become very profitable in the South. And so the South drags its feet on some of this, the protection of obvious natural rights. But the founding generation, I think, yeah, absolutely committed to it and trying to work out what it looked like in practice.
Thank you very much for a fascinating conversation. And we've got another great panelist and some audience questions to get to. So got to pass it, but thank you.
All right, thank you.
Hi, so this is Caroline Andrews. That last question actually ties perfectly into my first. This one's a little more biographical. So he was there, Sherman was, for the Articles of Association, the Declaration, and the Articles of Confederation. How much do you think those 3 major gatherings of people with different beliefs impacted his ability to compromise at the Constitutional Convention?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So yeah, he's there for just everything. And even as he's doing all this stuff at the national level, he continues to serve in the upper house of the Connecticut legislature and on the Superior Court in Connecticut. He serves more days in the Continental Confederation Congress than all but like 3 or 4 other men. And he's just a player. Let me just give you one example of this. In 1776, there are 3 committees that we might look back on and say these are the really important committees. The committee to draft the Declaration of Independence, the committee to draft the Articles of Confederation, and the Board of War, which kind of helped run the war, which is probably the most important committee. Sherman is the only person to be on all 3 of those committees. Young Thomas Jefferson was only on one, the committee to draft the Declaration of Independence. So if you had walked into the Continental Congress in 1776 and say, who is really, really important here? People would have pointed to Sherman, and Jefferson becomes far more important over the course of his life, but at this point, not at all. Sherman is there, and he shows an ability to work with others to get beyond his prejudices. So Sherman is a Calvinist. a follower of John Calvin. His pastor is actually Jonathan Edwards Jr., the son of the famous Jonathan Edwards. He is buying and reading. Jonathan Edwards Jr. is publishing his dad's works. He's buying and reading. So he's a very committed Calvinist. But when he also served on the board of Yale, and Ezra Stiles queried him, do you object to bringing in this Roman Catholic professor to teach French? And he said no. Even though he would have thought Roman Catholics were way wrong in terms of religion, he's able to work with them. And he showed this ability, I think, at the Continental Congress. Yeah, I mean, he spent a lifetime in politics, really, and developed the ability to work with people he disagreed with, to work with people like James Madison. You know, they had very different visions of what the Constitution should look like. They worked together. There was actually a study by a political scientist that showed that sometimes Madison and Sherman agreed. When they disagreed, Sherman actually won more of those battles than he lost, but they were able to work together on things. And he was able to work with someone like a Hamilton and a James Wilson. And this is just a critical lesson for today, I think. You know, we tend to treat someone who has a commitment to a different political party than we do as the enemy. And that's just toxic, right? We need to be able to work with people, even if they have radically different beliefs, and try to find ways in which we can come together, ways in which we can compromise and, you know, support the common good.
That part about Jonathan Edwards Jr. was so cool because I'm a very big Jonathan Edwards fan. I've read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. That was, y'all just saw me geek out live and in person over learning that. And I actually have a couple Jonathan Edwards books. So I'm wondering, now I really want to learn more about Roger Sherman. Do you have any book recommendations for me or for any of the students listening who might want to do more personal research?
Yeah, so my book, Roger Sherman and the Creation of the American Republic, is actually very accessible. It's published with by Oxford University Press, but it's aimed, you know, for certainly a college student would have no trouble reading it and appreciating it. Christopher Collier has a very good biography of Sherman, but interestingly, Professor Collier, who's a very prominent student at Connecticut history, he basically ignores the importance of Sherman's faith, which that's maybe one of the contributions that I bring in my book. I actually have a colleague who just wrote a new colleague who wrote a doctoral dissertation on Roger Sherman as a theologian. Again, here's someone who is debating with John Witherspoon of Princeton. When is it appropriate for Christians to get divorced? And both of them were convinced almost never. And so they're debating these edge cases. Sherman wrote a sermon, which he published. You know, he's intimately involved in doing these sorts of things. So, and again, yeah, to bring it back to Edwards, Jonathan, you know, of course, Jonathan Edwards Sr. eventually lost his pulpit because he had a habit of saying unpopular things. This was true with Jonathan Edwards Jr., and it was pretty clear the only reason he kept his pulpit as long as he did was because Roger Sherman and his family supported him in that position. Eventually, and unfortunately, Sherman died 1793, and Jonathan Edwards Jr. lost his pulpit shortly thereafter.
Thank you for answering that. I've got a lot of research to do once this is over now, because I want to learn a lot about that. So kind of switching gears, we talked about the Connecticut Compromise. There are now two houses of the legislature. Talking about checks and balances, do those two houses check each other as well within the legislature?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So as you know, in order for any bill to become a law, it has to pass in the exact same form in both the House and the Senate. So, you know, the House could be all a flutter about something and, you know, think this is the greatest thing ever. But if the Senate doesn't like it, the Senate can kill it. And this is, of course, before the development of the filibuster, but especially now with the filibuster, the Senate has a minority within the Senate can kill something. We've abandoned the filibuster in some respects, but it's still there for others. And so that's a very important check. There are some checks that founders put in the Constitution that in retrospect, I don't think were all that important. All finance bills, for instance, revenue bills have to originate from the House. That was seen as an important check on the Senate. But of course, in reality, once a bill originates, the Senate can take that bill and revise it and amend it to, you know, the nth degree. And so it really isn't much of a check in practice.
So I guess continuing on the line of checks, how specifically did the founders see the state legislatures appointing senators as kind of a check? How did that work in their minds?
Yeah, so think about it today. A lot of politicians really, their allegiance is to the people who elect them, not to their state or not even to their congressional district in certain respects. And so if I'm simply concerned with being reelected and I'm a senator, I have to pay attention to what my constituents want and not necessarily what's good for the state that I'm serving from. Whereas if it was a state legislature who selected me, if I want to keep my job, I really have to pay attention to what the state legislature wants, and they're probably thinking more in terms of the interest of the state than I might be. Now, I'm not suggesting these things are wildly different. So if I'm a senator from Kansas, I'm probably going to care a lot about agricultural policy, and that's exactly what the legislature would want me to do. But I do think there's still that added connection to the state that we've lost with the 17th Amendment.
Yeah, the first time I learned that state legislatures appointed people was when my dad showed me Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And I sat there for probably half the movie confused, going, why does it matter that these people are upset? Before I actually had that explained to me. So I think that's super cool. Thank you so much for answering my questions. I know it's a little early in my time, but I am all out. A lot of them were answered in other sessions, and I have learned a lot right now.
Yeah, well, thank you. Let me say quickly so people don't think I'm imagining a wonderful past that never existed. There were a lot of abuses when state legislatures appointed senators. The rich, fat cat billionaire might just spread a lot of money around and find himself appointed to the Senate. So I'm not saying that is the ideal way. But I think it did have benefits, and there are benefits that we have lost as we've shifted how we do how we select senators.
Definitely. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Caroline and Jewel and Janine. And this has been, and thank you, of course, Dr. Hall. This has been a great discussion, and we've got a lot of audience interest. Before we go to the audience, I'm going to recognize a few of our homeschool families that are watching today. Hope Mucklow is on with homeschool students, as well as Cami Wanis with Kenyon Wanis, a homeschool student. And so we thank you all for joining us today. We also want to thank Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM on the radio dial. KKVV airs these podcasts on Mondays at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you to Las Vegas for listening to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. So in looking at our audience questions, first of all, we have had quite a bit of interest in the audience Q&A on the Electoral College. And I want to make sure our audience knows that next week, Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, we're going to be talking all about the Electoral College. And it's a perfect topic for Election Day, which is next Tuesday, November 5th. So we will have on an Electoral College expert and a young person as well to talk about sort of the next generation's take on the Electoral College. And it should be a really exciting show. I want to give a shout out to Martha Jenkins, who's in our audience, who was a member of the Electoral College in 2016. And Martha says, I looked into this a little bit more. It looks like that every state is different on if they release the names of the Electoral College or not. It looks like some do and some may not. They eventually all do after the general election, but Martha was an elector in North Carolina in 2016. And Martha says, in modern times, the members of the Electoral College are known. As a member in 2016, I was inundated with mail and email trying to influence my vote, although I was bound by law to vote for the winner in my state. So, and then Sandy Thatcher had a sort of a question, and Dr. Hall, I don't know if you think we ought to table this till next week or not, but Sandy says, please comment on the role of state legislators in choosing the electors for the Electoral College. Does that vary from state to state? Are some chosen by the state? I seem to recall maybe some are, and some are maybe voted on by members of the party. But
So
Do you
your
know?
expert next week will be in a better position to answer this definitively. It's my understanding that what happens in most states is the Republican Party of the state will say, let's say you have 10 electoral votes, they'll say, okay, these are 10 electors, and they'll put them forward. The Democrats will do the same, the Green Party will do the same. So I think it's the party that selects them. Now, what is interesting, as your member from North Carolina suggested, about 20 states have laws requiring electors to vote for the person they're supposed to vote for. But that means the rest don't. And so conceivably, you could be a bad Republican elector who decides that he likes a Democrat more than the Republican. And so you could have a Republican elector cast a vote for a Democrat. What we see more often, and you see this 1 or 2 times every election, it seems, is usually someone on the losing side will try to send a message. So one of Ford's electors in 1976 cast his ballot for Ronald Reagan. You know, kind of look at, here's this guy, I really wish he had been the nominee. And now it didn't cost Ford the election because he had, you know, definitively won, but we have these unfaithful electors. Whether or not states can legally require electors to vote for the person they're supposed to vote for is unclear, but it's never been litigated. So courts haven't weighed in on that yet.
Well, fascinating. And we hope everybody comes back next week for sure to join us on that topic. So I also want to read a comment from Hope Mucklow. Hope says, hi, Constituting America. What a great topic and discussion. How inspiring to hear how important and impactful Sherman was without a college education. And we learned so much today. Thank you. So thank you from Hope. And then Julianne Smith writes, if Sherman were alive today, what do you think would be his greatest shock and disappointment of where we are as a nation and our Constitution?
You know, I think almost all of the founders would be absolutely horrified by the power the national government has come to have. Maybe not Hamilton, maybe not Wilson, but almost all the rest of them would have said, "What in the world? This is a recipe for disaster." Right? I think almost to a person, they would have agreed with Lord Acton that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So they wanted to limit the power of the national government. So that's one thing they would have been horrified by. And then I think the power that the chief executive of the United States has come to have and expect, especially acting through the administrative state, through executive orders, they would have been absolutely horrified by both of those things. You know, some change probably was necessary to deal with life in the 20th and now 21st century. A lot of that change could have been done properly through constitutional amendments, it seems to me. And we would do well to ratchet back the power of the presidency and the power of the national government altogether to something approximating what the founders had in mind.
Well, thank you. And then Sandy Thatcher also asked, did Sherman interact with William Livingston much? I think Sandy's dad actually wrote a book on William Livingston, which Sandy, by the way, is very generous to donate to our Constituting America online auction each year. So, but do you know anything about William Livingston? And
yeah, sure. They interacted in the Continental Confederation Congress, and they served together on the 5-person committee that put together the Declaration of Independence. One of the problems with that committee is everything we know about the workings of that committee come from Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Ben Franklin. So it's just kind of impossible to know what Livingston and Sherman might have contributed, in part because they were so busy doing other things, whereas someone like Jefferson is constantly wringing his hands about how he's going to be remembered in the future. Jefferson, if you go to Monticello, you'll see a machine he designed whereby if you write a letter with a pen, it basically traces it on a separate document so he could save it for posterity. So Jefferson is clearly looking to his place in history, where someone like a Roger Sherman is just too busy being a husband and father. He had something like 18 kids, you know, serving in the state, serving in the national government, making a living. You don't really support yourself in politics alone. And so he's running stores and doing legal work and this sort of thing. Sherman's busy doing a lot of stuff, whereas Jefferson, the plantation owner, has the luxury to read, you know, fancy books and work on his Latin and think about his place in history. I'm not trying to take anything away from Jefferson. I went to Mr. Jefferson's University. He's a flawed individual, but a great individual in many respects. I'm just trying to highlight the difference between a Sherman and a Jefferson.
Well, thank you. And then Judy has texted in a question asking that you've mentioned Roger Sherman, and you wrote a book on James Wilson, is that right? Two founding fathers that you don't hear that much about. Is there another founding father that you think should deserve a little bit more publicity or knowledge about that maybe we haven't mentioned today? And would you like to talk about another
Yeah,
one?
that's a wonderful question. I don't even have to go to my own opinion. So about a decade ago, my friend Gary Gregg of the McConnell Center and we decided to do a survey. And basically we set it up just like I set today up. We said, look, everyone knows the four founders who became president, Hamilton and Franklin. Other than these founders, who are the most important founders that deserve to be known? And we sent the survey to something like 90 academics, historians, political scientists, law professors. They sent us back a whole long list, probably 69 altogether. We took the top 30 vote getters and then we sent them out and we said, okay, now rank. Which are the most important of these forgotten founders? And this was published as a book, America's Forgotten Founders. And so you can easily get that book and read it. And you'll see James Wilson is #1 by far and away. Roger Sherman's on the list. John Dickinson of Delaware's on the list. George Mason of Virginia is on the list. And I forget exactly the rest. Maybe Oliver Ellsworth is on the list. But yeah, you find a real good, I don't even like the label, but you could call them second tier founders. They aren't as important as George Washington or James Madison, but they're awfully doggone important. And if we want to understand the founding generation, if we want to understand the founders, we just have to get beyond a focus on the elite 5 or 6 and look at the founding generation.
Well, that's fascinating. I'm going to definitely look that book up. Forgotten Founders. That's the name of the book.
America's Forgotten Founders.
America's
That's right.
Forgotten Founders. And Constituting America did an online study a few years ago where we took the Declaration of Independence and we divided it into 90 essays, and we pretty much dissected almost every sentence of the Declaration, but then we also looked at every signer of the Declaration. So we have essays on our website, at least, about every signer of the Declaration. And some of the signers were much easier to find volunteer essayists for than others, but we did get all those filled out. So that's fascinating. Andrew K. writes, it seems to me that the lack of ability to compromise is more based on the polarization induced by political parties than by visibility of what is being done, although the two do feed upon each other. Commitment to political party labels induces inflexibility and prevents compromise, does it not? And is that something the founders didn't have to deal with as much as we do now?
Yeah, I would, that's a very insightful question. I would say it's probably even worse than a commitment to political parties, because how do we choose our candidates? Everywhere now, House candidates, Senate candidates, we choose them through a primary. And what state legislatures have gotten really good at is coming up with districts that are stuffed with Republicans or they're stuffed with Democrats. And so if I'm an elected member of Congress, and I'm from a conservative district, if I even think about compromising with the Democrats, I have to fear that I'm going to be primaried from the right. And so even if my party leadership is saying, hey, here's a real important bill that we need to pass so we have a sensible budget or a sensible border policy or something like that, I can't go along with my party leadership because I don't want to get primaried from the right or primaried from the left on the other side of things, right? So I think that's a huge problem. And then I would also blame social media quite a bit. I think far too many, a lot of people might ignore it, but people on the ideological extremes just spend way too much time in social media, and they're oftentimes very ugly on social media, and it contributes to this this really coarse public discourse that we're assaulted with every day. So I think these two things go together to help make a perfect storm that I'm not sure how to get get away from. It's a fun question. I used to have a chance to teach a couple of courses with a former U.S. Senator, Senator Mark Hatfield. And I asked him one time, who are the greatest senators we've ever had? And right away, without missing a beat, he said Webster, Clay, and Calhoun. Do you know how we got those senators? They were selected by state legislatures. Whereas today, if you want to be a senator, you have to basically, kowtow to the general public of your state. And if you're, again, conservative senator for conservative state, you really can't compromise, or you'll be primaried from the right, and vice versa on the left.
Well, thank you. And we were just about to the top of the hour, but Lewis White also thanks you for pointing out the problem with the 17th Amendment and lessening the power of the states. And we just thank you today for a fascinating show. And I know we all learned so much. And Caroline, we loved having you join us today as a panelist. And Jewel and Janine. Janine, do you have any closing words that you want to take us out with?
Oh, no, I just echo. It was a very stimulating conversation. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for listening, and go out and vote. Vote early. Thank you.
Thank you. And join us next week, Tuesday, November 5th, after you voted. And we're going to be talking all about the Electoral College and really go in depth on it so that we can all understand what's going on election night. So thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Hall. And we'll see you all next week.